Ladies and gentlemen,
Yeah.
Suzy Phare.
Hi.
I'm so excited. You were asking me, I think a little bit when we were off camera, like how come we're doing this again or whatever.
Yeah.
And the honest answer is just because I really enjoyed our first conversation.
It's
So
fun. It's fun to just chat,
yeah,
right?
I get a ton out of talking to you. And for everybody listening, I've worked with Suzy at a professional capacity a few times. You've helped us navigate some stuff with our business, some stuff with our partnership, and you've done these things. And then just, I guess a few weeks ago, our team went to your lunch and learn, and you've just been impactful on so many different levels. And so anyway, it's
That's
just
great to
honestly
hear. Yeah.
fun for me.
Yeah.
If you haven't listened to the first episode with Suzy, you should, but I'm going to introduce you again just for
Okay.
everybody who's listening.
Yeah.
Suzy owns Real Ideal Coaching. You've got over 20 years of experience in human resources and executive coaching and leadership coaching,
Right.
and all of these things. You basically work with essentially every major company in La Plata County, or have at least.
Maybe, yeah.
But if everybody check out Suzy's website, because the stuff you do and the people that you work with is really cool, and it just speaks to you and your energy. And that's why I'm so excited to have you back on, because every time I get to chat with you, I feel like, first of all, you're a wealth of knowledge. And so it's just fun to have an opportunity to pick your brain and like have you as a captive audience to learn from you. I was joking a second ago that this is how I hustle for my free coaching sessions.
Yep.
No, but also I think it's just really impactful, the information that you have. I think a lot of people don't have access to people like you and coaches and these things like that. And you have these powerful tools in your toolbox. That's just really fun.
Yeah.
Do you mind, just to kind of warm it up a little bit, and I know we kind of dove into your background last time,
Yeah.
but want to just kind of revisit that a little bit on
Sure.
your coaching journey. Tell me, about what you do, what your specialty is in,
Yeah.
and things like that. And then I've got some questions that I'm excited to dive in on.
Okay, sweet. So I grew up in the Seattle area. My degree from the University of Washington is in what was called speech communication at the time, which is basically how people like relate to each other and communicate with each other, and groups, how groups dynamics are, and how we deal with conflict, and interpersonally just how we get along. And I've always been fascinated by that. It's always been something that's lit me up to figure that out. My husband laughs at me because I watch shows like, there's a show that's all about like couples therapy, and I watch that to like learn about how people are, right? Like how he's like, this is like her hobby is to watch how people interact
Observe
with each
people
other,
yeah.
right? But it comes in so handy when you work in human resources. What's funny is just recently I've been helping out with a local business here who's looking for an HR director. And so I've been kind of going in, and it's been so fun to have all those interactions with people where I get to help people on a day-to-day basis with things other than leadership and the things that I do in my business now, but going kind of back to my roots, which is in HR. So I worked in HR for 20 years. I had a job at Microsoft right out of college. I worked for a Panasonic affiliate for a while, some larger companies, and then I also worked at Atari, where they made games. They're actually, shout out to the backyard sports franchise,
It's coming
because
back.
somebody bought it and
Yes.
they're bringing it back. And all my friends from Atari that created that brand, I'm so excited for them because it's so fun to see all.
Yeah. I'm actually stoked on that, because I kind of
cool.
grew up playing that, and I'm not a
Yeah.
video games guy.
Yeah.
So the list of video games that I played is
Short.
very,
But
there's
that was
3 or
one of
4
them,
on
right?
them, and that
Yeah.
was on it. Yeah,
Yep.
that's
Well,
awesome.
I know all those artists and designers and that made most of that stuff. So it's so cool to see that coming back around. So big shout out to the backyard baseball franchise, backyard sports.
Backyard sports, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious, because I've picked up on that from you. I'm trying to think how to explain it, but you've got this like intuition about you that you can read people
Yeah.
almost scarily well. Like I feel vulnerable when I'm around. I'm kidding, but
You should.
You really do have a way of, I don't know, understanding what people are saying, even if they're saying it differently, or like seeing different perspectives. You've kind of got this like open-minded intuition about you that I've been able to observe
Yeah.
when you're working in group settings or, with individuals or things like that.
Yeah.
I was asked a while back, I did a Q&A, to celebrate my 50th podcast. I did a Q&A, and somebody asked me if I have always been as optimistic as I am. And I was like, I don't know. So I asked my parents, and I have been. What I'm curious about is, because it seems to me like I'm going to just call it found your calling, of coaching and working with people at the kind of intimate level that you get to.
Yes.
I'm curious if that intuition and that connection with other human beings has been something that you've had your whole life, or is that something that you've worked on and kind of intentionally, grown?
Yeah. I think I've always been really inquisitive.
Inquisitive.
Yeah, I think I've always asked a lot of questions, and I think to be a good coach, that's one of the skill sets that I would say. In fact, I would say to be a good leader, like one of the biggest skill sets I say is your ability to ask good questions of your people, because it's not your job to know all the answers. It's your job to be able to figure out if the people around you are the right people and if they're, if they can do what you need them to do, right? So asking empowering questions is something that I talk with people about a lot, and I teach people a lot. And I have a friend who I went to college with who called me Detective Suzy because I would always
So it has
ask
always been
questions,
Yeah.
right? I don't know if I was that way in elementary school, but my mom is a social worker, and my dad worked in the community college system. So I think like socially that they always had that. And I think both of them are very intellectual. And so, they both we would have conversations about people and about like what made people the way they are or why they behaved the way that they did. That was like in my family, that was kind of normal. Emotions, we talk about emotions and all that kind of stuff, where a lot of families, that's not the norm.
Right.
And so I think that kind of like brought me to that. And then I think just, childhood trauma and all of the things that everybody has, made me a very inquisitive little child. So I could be really quiet, but I could really like see everyone's perspective on what was going on, and I would kind of pick it apart. And if I could make sense of it in my head, what was going on, then it made me feel safer. And so I think that skill set probably came out of the ability to like make myself feel okay in certain situations by figuring out like, why is that person acting that way? Why is that person saying that? What do they mean by that? What do they really mean by that? So I think there was just like layers upon layers upon layers. And then my degree, going into human resources, working at larger companies, working at smaller companies, and then just being the sounding board for people a lot. Like people will tell me a lot of the time when I interview people, we'll have like a group of people that will interview people, and then I'll sit down with the hiring manager and I'll say, what did you get from the feedback? And they'll say this, this, and this. And I'll be like, well, I kind of thought that this was happening for this reason. And they'll always say like, oh, I never even thought about that. So it helps a lot of the time to just be able to kind of reflect with somebody else. But a lot of the time I say things and people are like, I guess I didn't see
wrong.
that, but you're right. No, yeah.
Right.
But
Yeah.
you're right. So, yeah.
So and I've got a few follow-up questions
Sure.
from that. But I wonder if that's why we get along so well, is because I've always been fascinated with psychology. Like why people do what they do.
Totally.
Or like
Me too.
what's going on, what's happening here really? Like why are we not getting along, or what's up with the tension here, or what? I've always been extremely fascinated with that. And it's interesting. I'm kind of curious. Try to not let me forget. I want to come back to that empowering questions idea.
Sure.
But while it's top of mind, it seems like sort of the world of psychology and coaching collide or overlap. Like what's your take on, or do you think that that's unique to your perspective on executive and leadership coaching?
So that's a really interesting question. I think that if you're intuitive and you're a coach, you're going to be a better coach. I think a lot of what comes through and a lot of what we have to learn when we coach is how to be intuitive in our listening and in our questioning, right? So sometimes when we're listening to somebody, we can't just take it at face value. We have to understand what they're saying underneath. Sometimes I say the thing behind the thing. Mm-hmm. You have to understand what is going on in addition to what they're telling you, right? So there's like the emotion, you see it on their face or their body language or their tone of voice that's saying things that their words might not be saying.
Right.
So we've had meetings, right, where we've been with you and your partner and we've sat down and I'm watching the dynamics of what's going on with you guys as well as what you're telling me or what she's telling me. So that's what helps sometimes to get you over some humps or some things that are harder, is because when you're in the middle of it, sometimes it's a little bit harder, but when you're trained to be looking for that stuff and trained to be knowledgeable about it, to your question, to answer your question about psychology and coaching, I think people are drawn to coaching that have that curiosity, like what you have about psychology. I think psychology is a much broader and deeper specialty than coaching.
Right.
So I think the fact that I have intuition and the fact that I grew up with somebody who was a social worker and could look at things through those lenses really helps me with what I do. But we're not counselors, and we're trained to refer people on to mental health if they need
for
that.
professional on really
Yes.
that side of it.
Yeah. And that comes in when there's more like behaviors that aren't changing, or you're working with somebody on the same thing all the time and it's not getting better. That's not a coaching situation. You need therapy, or you need to talk to somebody that can work with you on a deeper level around that. What I do more is focus on what are some things you don't like about what you're doing or how you're showing up, and how do we make that better, or challenging you on, skill sets that maybe you haven't honed in on or wanted to improve because you didn't know how important they were to being a leader.
Right. Yeah. I just am curious about that idea of, intuition, and because I sometimes, maybe to a fault, I lead with emotion. Like I'm intuitively driven. Like I can read a room. I can understand what's going on behind, what's happening with what they're the thing behind the thing.
The thing behind the
I'm
thing.
usually able to pick up on the thing behind the thing. I've found that when I'm in a leadership capacity, that becomes way more complicated than in just like a normal interpersonal relationship, because there's nuance and complexities. So it's like, sometimes I'll observe something like that, like the underlying meaning, or what are they really saying, or whatever it is. But then also know that, there's business decisions that have to happen, or other dynamics, or like if this happens, then that might happen, and kind of like, looking it down. And so I just think that it's an interesting thing to consider of like, from a leadership perspective of where like training versus intuition, and which one to follow and when and all that. And I know that.
So that actually goes back to your question about empowering questions. So in reality, when you see the thing behind the thing, and what you're talking about is seeing what's going to happen down the road, and that's because you're strategic, which is why you own a business, right? A lot of people aren't strategic naturally, and those people, it's harder for them to jump out and start a business like the way that you have. But what I teach people about and what we talk about is when you can learn to ask good questions, what you tend to get is you get to start to understand the thought process of the people that work for you.
Interesting.
So when you ask good questions, or if you think you know what the thing behind the thing is, you start to drill down on that, like, well, what if this happened? Well, what if that happened? And you start to see, wow, their thinking really is strategic, or their thinking really is in alignment with what I think. That's when you start to build those. That's like the building blocks of trust, right? So they do know what they're talking about. I can trust them to make decisions more than what I have been giving them. Say there's somebody new, or even somebody that you've known for a long time, but you've always managed them. Now you can start to lead them, which is tell me what you think, walk me through why you think that, tell me what pitfalls you see, what might be great about doing that, and then that in turn, them giving you those answers when you're like, oh, they really do get it, it builds trust that they're an employee that you want to have on your staff, or that there's somebody that you want around, right? And if they have that ability to be strategic, then there's potential for them to move up into higher roles, or for you to have different kinds of conversations where you can talk at a deeper level with them. And that actually, all those things are kind of building blocks to build trust.
Right.
With people around you.
So empowering questions build trust, which then obviously lets you lead, at a different capacity. I want to talk a little bit more about empowering questions.
Sure.
And you've also used the phrase a good question.
Yeah.
What's the difference between a good question and a bad question?
Well, so when you're talking about empowering questions and you want to say whether it's a good or bad question, it's pretty simple. Empowering questions are open-ended questions. So if I ask you, do you think we should, take that account, and somebody says yes or no, that's a question. It's an okay question, but it's a closed question. If you say, what would be the benefits of taking that account, and what do you think would be the drawbacks of taking that account? Those are empowering questions.
Okay.
Tell me the benefits. So they have to actually think, and it's not a one-word answer. It's not like yes or no, but it's, well, they would be good for our revenue for this reason. They would be, they'd have to give you more substantial response.
Forces thought.
Yes. Yeah. So
Got
a lot
it.
of the times I'll do exercises with, I work with executive teams, and a lot of the time I'll do an exercise where I sit down and I make them tell each other a problem, and then they tell each other the problem, and then I say, okay, do what you would normally do, and they all go into problem-solving mode, and they solve the problem. They're like, well, you know what you should do? They start shooting on them, right? You should do this, you should do that.
Shooting on them. That's a good one.
They tell you all what you should do, right? And then I say, okay, now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to flip. You're going to come up with a problem, and what you're going to do is you have to ask 3 empowering questions before you can give any advice. You just have to you have to ask 3 open-ended questions. And what tends to happen is that what they see is the dynamic is that, wow, by asking 3 questions, you got to the deeper meaning of what was going on, and you really got me to think about the best possible outcome rather than you told me what, in your experience, would be the best solution to this problem.
Right.
But the reality is that's not usually what the best solution is for the person that's trying to solve the problem. That's what your solution is. In fact, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I can't remember what it was, but they were talking about how giving advice is like selfish.
Yeah.
Right? Because when you give advice, you're basically taking away the opportunity of the person who needs help to solve their own problem. Right? And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. I never thought of it that way. But it's true, right? Like if we just give advice to everybody, we're thinking that our experience and what we know trumps everything else.
Right.
Right? But if you can ask some good questions of your people or good questions of those around you or good questions of people that want advice, then you get to help them solve their own problems, and they're more empowered, and what they're probably going to do, they resonate more with and probably feel better about.
And if nothing else, they'll have more ownership of the solution.
Right.
So yeah, what an interesting thing to consider, that giving advice is selfish.
Yeah.
It almost, I've juggled it here. So I've been in the digital marketing industry for,
a long time.
yeah, 17 years now or something.
Wow.
And so I wrestle with this, like I do know what I'm talking about, but I also like to think that I've hired people much smarter than me on purpose.
That's the goal.
And so I can, get out of their way and all of that. And so it almost reminds me of that saying, how you say, if we always do what we've always done, we'll always get what we've always got.
Yep.
Like if we always do it Ben's way, we're always going to get what we've always had.
Well, and then you're also you're setting yourself up for them always needing Ben to be around.
Right.
And that's not what you want to do when you're a business owner.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No. So it's interesting. I'm curious. You're speaking of my free coaching session, but like just today, I had an employee come to me with a question, and I did okay. So you'll be a little proud,
Good.
but I didn't do perfect.
Okay.
Instead of asking an open-ended question, I just responded with that I trust you. Tell me about pros and cons to responses like that. Like, because all I said was I trust you.
Yeah.
And
I think depending on what it was that they were coming to you with, that's a great response if you do really trust them. But what happens is you give them a response of I trust you, they go and make a decision that you wouldn't. And then now it's like, because they know they screwed up, that like basically says, okay, he doesn't trust me.
Sure.
Right? Or he can't trust me now because I screwed up. Like he said he trusted me and then I screwed up. Whereas if you would have said something like, what are you thinking? And they would have said, this is what I'm thinking. You could be like, great, go for it.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Right? But that's an open-ended question. Like, well, tell me what
do
you're
you think?
thinking. Right? And then you also get to see, you get to be the person that understands because you have all the experience. So you get to ask the right questions. Oh, well, if that happens, then what do you think might happen after that? Or, okay, let's say we did that and then they came back and asked us this. Because you're thinking that in like 2 seconds flat. They're not. And so if you can start asking the questions, it teaches them to start asking themselves the same questions when they're trying to make a decision about what to do with something.
Do you, not to get too far off track, so don't let us, but
hey, we have all the time in the world, right?
do you use your like coaching expertise in the tactics that you've learned in parenting?
Parenting, somewhat, yes. My kids are very bright, and they're like, "Don't use that coaching crap on me, Mom." So I mean, they're like,
there.
I have a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old, so they don't want to listen anyway. But they really are like, they can tell when don't ask me a question right now. Just tell me what you think, or don't bring that coaching stuff here.
Right.
It kind of doesn't. I mean, It's hard. It's funny. I'm in a coaching group, so a lot of the coaches in Durango, we all have the group. Then we meet quarterly, and we just met a couple like last week, and we were talking about like sometimes it's hard to turn off the coaching because like you meet people or you're talking about something, and instead of just being a person, you're like, well, what about this and what about that? And you have all these questions
because it's who you are.
Because it's who I am. I'm Detective Suzy, right? Like, I'm inquisitive. That's who I am.
Yeah.
So.
It just reminds me, like, a formative time of my family's, time was we went to some family counseling for a little while, which was really beneficial because it got us, like, trauma educated, and it provided us with a lot of tools to solve problems.
I'm a big fan of therapy.
Much like coaching gives, people a lot of tools to navigate those things. But it is funny now because sometimes we'll catch ourselves being like, I saw an Instagram comment the other day that I just thought was hilarious. That was like, maybe the real reward is the gaslighting we learned along the way or something. It's like, sarcasm. But, no, I was just curious because, like, I mean, they're so different. But leading a company or leading a division or leading a team or leading a family, there are still
a lot of similarities.
Leadership things.
Yes. Well, and I think we talked about this a little bit the first time I was on, but to me, leadership is all about influence. And as a parent, you're trying to influence your kids. You're not trying to necessarily tell them every step of the way of what to do, but you're trying to be a good influence, and then you're trying to ask good questions to see if they understand, that. But some of that, when you're parenting, is leaning more towards, I'd like you to understand this.
Right.
Whereas, hopefully if you're being a good leader, it's more from a place of curiosity, like, what do you think? Because you've hired somebody that's good, and you need to let them be good, not just tell them what to do. Whereas sometimes with your kids, your role is to help them see why the decision they're making isn't necessarily the right decision. Right?
Yeah.
Whereas with people in your company, I think you want to ask the right questions, but you also want to support them. And so if they can come to the conclusion that works for them and you can accept it or it's okay with you, a lot of the time it's like, let them run with it, because there's value in making mistakes too.
Yeah.
Same with kids, right? We want them to make mistakes sometimes. Like, we can't protect them from every single thing that's going to happen. Right? They wouldn't be good people if they never made mistakes in their life, or if they were always protected from, getting a boo-boo or whatever. But with employees, I think that letting them make a mistake is also a really important part of letting them grow, and to walk through what happened, kind of do that post-mortem where you're like,
I was
okay,
just going to
that
ask,
didn't
what do you
work.
do once the mistake happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really about doing that kind of, somebody I worked with called it a post-mortem, but I think it was a military's term. But it's really going back and saying, okay, let's walk through what happened. What were you thinking when you made that decision? Now that you know, what would you do differently? So then again, that's building trust, right? Like, they can look at what happened and they can figure out what went wrong, and so they won't do it again.
Yeah,
right?
That's interesting. So, I volunteer on the fire department at Fort Lewis Mesa, and my Chief Lee, amazing guy. I keep trying to get him on the podcast. One of these days I will.
One day he will.
In fact, I'm going to snap this and send it to him. But,
cool.
He has a background in the military and special forces and things like that. And at the fire department, they call it an AAR. It's a after action review.
Yeah.
And we basically huddle up, and it's whether it's after a training or a real call or whatever, and we just talk about our takeaways.
Right.
And it's a pretty safe, kind of neutral environment. Where it's not like nobody's pointing fingers or whatever. And It's kind of our opportunity. Like, if we messed up or we learned something, it's our chance to say, before Chief has to tell us, it's our chance to say, I didn't do the thing right, or, and next thing I have to do it that way. Yeah. And I wonder if there's a healthy way to sort of debrief. Post-mortem maybe is a little dramatic, but maybe not. Healthy debrief. Because that's one of the things where that dilemma is, right? It's like, we want to empower our employees and our team members to make mistakes, but we also need to correct when mistakes happen, or at least like correct course and keep the ball rolling for the business.
Yes.
So I wonder if there's just like a healthy environment or a healthy way to kind of incorporate debriefs into the business. Have you seen anything like that ever?
I mean, I think it's exactly what you just said, what your chief does. It's like, what you huddle up when a big project's done, like, say that you got, a big project that you were doing for a client, and then the project wraps up. I think it's always good to have like that post project discussion where you say what went well, what didn't go well, what would you do differently next time, what do you think we could do better as a team. So again, you're facilitating a discussion with a lot of open-ended questions. So you're not like,
and it's still good questions.
It's good questions.
Empowering questions.
Yes. Right? So it's not like, did we do good on that project? Yes.
So more of, let's just theoretically, a problem happened or something went wrong, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
And, you're the boss, like, all right, I'm going to, Michael
see
Scott
that
at the
something
office.
you
Everyone,
see that
conference
something
room
went
now,
wrong. Okay.
And, I think for a lot of us, at least speaking for myself, the instinct is to kind of like, bear down's not the right word. It's not that extreme, but, like correct the situation.
Yeah.
Am I correct in my understanding or my assumption that a more effective approach would probably be to incorporate those empowering questions and then more of a like, let's all share this process of what went wrong, why did that client cancel, who did, and kind of make it a collective approach?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think and this is different than if one person makes a mistake in your group. If you're talking about kind of like as a whole, like you lost a client or something like that, I think bringing the group in is great. But I think what happens is that when people start to see that everybody has some feedback or opinions about what happened, it helps you grow as a team because you might think something didn't go well and I might think it went well. And if we get a little healthy debate on, well, what was good about that and what do you think was bad about that, then you as a group, you learn better how to do things, right?
And you get the benefit of multiple perspectives.
Totally.
Because,
and it's safer because everybody's kind of in it together and you're a team dealing with it rather than, I'm going to call you out because you're the one who talked negatively to them and then that's what made them cancel.
Right.
Right? That needs to be discussed too. And I think for that, it's like, say that you had an employee who lost their temper with a client, right? And then the client called you and they're like, we can't work with you guys anymore because this guy is, yelling at us, right? You can bring that person in and you can easily say something like, how did you feel about that interaction? Right? To understand what their perspective is. Walk me through what happened from your perspective. Because I think a lot of the time we go, okay, we just lost revenue because my employee did something.
And I'm pissed.
So I'm going to blame you and I'm going to get really mad at you. And so you kind of have these blinders on that you can't see that there's a lot more going on. So maybe you're like, your employee is like, yeah, every time I went out there and I was on time, the guy made me wait, 45 minutes and then this happened, that happened. I was supposed to be here. You wanted this to happen. And then he came up and, whatever it is, like they have a really good reason for why they lost their temper, right? But if we just are like, we just lost a client and it's your fault and we start to blame them and we don't give them the opportunity to say to us what happened, it can't really be a learning experience because then they feel like I just got in trouble and he didn't even listen to my side.
Right. So it's almost just best practices to approach everything inquisitively.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, generally speaking, obviously, there's nuance, and for everybody listening, there's nuance.
Right.
But because what a safer approach too. Like one of the things that scares the heck out of me as a leader and as a business owner and as a father is making a wrong decision.
Yeah.
Like all the time. It's like, I don't know. I'm doing, and I want to talk to you about imposter syndrome here in a minute too. I wrote it down. But, none of us have any idea what we're doing.
Right.
And if anybody says they do, they're lying.
Exactly.
We're all just out here
the reality.
Doing the best we can.
Yeah.
And so I kind of have this constant fear of like, I don't know if that's the right call or not. And especially when they're big, like,
big decisions.
Hiring and firing.
Right.
Or, changing a model or whatever. Like these big things. It's like, I with the information I have at hand, I think this is the best. Mm-hmm. But I think that I've had a tendency sometimes of like needing to lean into the decision and like standing behind it. And what you've just said there, I think is what a great takeaway, whether it's like disciplining an employee or course correcting an issue that went wrong or unpacking a big decision.
Yeah.
Addressing it with questions also takes the guesswork out of it as a leader.
Totally.
Like, for example, if there's that like the big hiring firing decision or whatever, the employee that needs the discipline.
Yeah.
What a great opportunity to learn more because then you're going to make a better decision anyway.
Right.
Because you'll have more information.
Totally.
Brilliant.
You got it.
Who would have thought?
Yeah.
Who would have thought?
Then there's
just
always
invoice me.
there's always two sides to every story. And so if you're going off, if you're making a decision, for discipline or something like that, based on one side, like the example I just gave, you have a client that said, your employee lost their stuff on me and I'm upset about it and we're not going to use you anymore. There's always two sides to the story. And as humans, what we all crave is to be heard. Mm-hmm. And so if you make a decision based on one side of the story or you haven't really heard out your employee, that doesn't build trust. It actually breaks trust, right? Because your employee thinks, well, they don't even listen to me. They didn't even ask me what my side of the story was. Right. They didn't really want to know what was going on with me, which makes them feel more like, what's the word I'm looking for? Not a human, but like just like a cog in the wheel, right?
A pawn.
Like you're just moving me around where you want me to be.
Which is the last thing we want.
Yeah.
Because me, I lead with so much heart, sometimes too much heart. So for everybody listening, I'm not like this dictator leader, but I'm learning a lot. And
can I tell you a little bit about decision making though? Finish what you're saying. And
No. Yeah, that I would love to hear more about decision making.
Okay, because related to that question, and I just talked to a client about this the other day. There's this thing called holographic. I think it's called holographic thinking, but it's basically, if you think of it as a triangle, there's 3 points to the triangle. One is the analytics of it. So is there numbers you need to look at? The data, right? So let's use the example of buying a car. This is the example I gave with my client the other day. Like, you're buying a car. So this would be the person that looks at consumer reports, like me. When I buy a car, right? I want to know the safety features. I want to know whether the people that own those cars like those cars. Like, I want the analytics of the car, right? Another point of that triangle is feelings. So that would be like, oh my God, I love purple. I'm going to buy the purple Porsche because I love purple, right? But it has no bearing on, like, people would look at you and go, you're crazy. Like, you're just doing it on your feeling.
Based on emotion.
Emotion, right? And then the third point of the triangle is intuition. And so what happens a lot of the time is you get this, when you're trying to make decisions, you're either too much in your head, you're too much in your heart, and you're not really listening to your gut. And so it's kind of a balance of all those 3 things when you're making decisions. So if you can start to think about that, really think about what your head is telling you. So like, let's say, if somebody's asking you for a discount and you need to think about whether or not you're going to give them the discount, you really need to process it through your head, and then you need to process it through kind of your heart, but then you also need to check in with your gut. Because what I find a lot of the time with my clients is when they're mulling over a really big decision, that they actually know what they need to do pretty like easily.
Yeah.
Like, they'll sit there and they'll talk about all the pros and cons of it, and while they're talking about it, it's like super obvious that they know exactly what they want to do.
Just had to talk it through.
But they don't want to say it.
Yeah.
They want to keep asking a question and keep mulling it over because not making a decision is making a decision. Right.
Well, and that's what I was going to add is, like, first of all, I love that. Your head, your heart, and your gut.
Yeah.
And balancing the 3 of those in decision making. And then, this idea of like gathering more information to make the best decision we can possible. Mm-hmm. But also, once you know the decision, you got to make the decision.
Yeah.
Like there's been I've had to make some very hard decisions recently that I knew what the decision was.
Yeah.
And like,
but you go talk to everybody about it, and you tell yourself that you don't know, but that's part of loving yourself is trusting yourself.
Yeah.
Part of loving yourself is checking in with yourself in those areas and then listening to yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like, and then the more you listen to yourself and you make the good decisions, the more you trust yourself. And that actually leads to you being able to make better decisions and love yourself more.
Positive feedback loop.
Right. Like, you're doing what you know is right. Whereas when I'm sure you've done it because we all have, right? Your gut is telling you, your head, your gut, and your feelings are telling you not to do something, and you do it anyway because you're like, oh, but we could make a lot of money,
right?
Right? Or we could whatever, and then you're like kicking yourself forever because hindsight's 20/20, right?
Yeah.
And you're saying, I knew I shouldn't have done that. But the practice is, can I sit with myself and really get those 3 aspects so that I know what I want to do, and that I can trust myself and do that thing. And even if it's wrong, so even if you find out later, like, wow, that didn't go the way that I wanted it to, you're learning from that opportunity.
Yeah.
You're learning from that decision. And nobody goes in life without making mistakes. And so you can't expect that every decision you're going to make is going to be the right one. The cool thing about being human is if you make the wrong decision, you just change and do the other thing.
Exactly.
It's like I mean, yes, there's life and death decisions, but most of the time that's not what we're dealing with in business.
And especially if you're genuinely doing the best you know how.
Right.
You know, like you're not being like malicious and, you know, whatever. Like you're sincerely doing the best you know how.
Yeah.
It can't go that wrong, you know.
And part of the analytics is collecting data
Right.
by asking good questions.
So I'm curious, and there may be no answer to this, but a hard one for you.
Sure.
Head, heart, gut, you know, the three.
Yeah.
Your mind, your mind, your intuition, and your heart.
Yeah.
What should you give more weight to? Like perfect world, like let's say theoretically, you're making a big decision and, you know, it's 50-50, heart and mind.
Yeah.
You know, just curious your take on it. Just, you know, knowing you don't have a crystal ball, but
I think that's why there's three points
intuition,
to the triangle,
sure,
because your intuition is really what's going to set you one way or the other.
It'll pull the weight.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
so
it makes sense.
Interestingly, like I was in Flagstaff this weekend with my daughter at a soccer tournament. She just turned 16 last week and she wants a car. And we went to a dealership and we saw a car and she wanted it because it was in the price range she wanted. It was the mileage she wanted and, you know, whatever. And what do? I go on to Consumer Reports and I'm like, this does not have good ratings and I don't want to buy you a car that doesn't have good ratings. And so, you know, I knew like intuitively, like this is not a good decision. Like if we do, I mean, there's a lot of other factors. You know, my husband wasn't there to like check it out or anything either. But, you know, I knew just intuitively, like, this is not the car for you. Am I going to say that to a, you know, intense 16-year-old who really wants a car? No. So what I did is I made her read Consumer Reports. And then I asked her, I said, what does your gut tell you? Like, is this really the car that you should get? Or should you wait until, you know, dad can look at it and you can drive it, you know, with dad and that you, you know, the other factors.
You asked empowering questions?
I did. I tried to, but I said like what and what goes into what the decision that you're making, like how do you want to make this decision? And she really knew, like her gut was like, I don't really want to buy a car if dad hasn't given me his approval, because she just knows like
I need everyone bought in on it because it's a team effort. Yeah.
Right. And if I buy this car, you know, my husband was like, if you want to get it. But like she knew, you know, if I buy it and then, you know, 5 months from now, the engine blows up, like, and dad didn't give me his stamp of approval, it's going to be a much different, like, you know, scenario than if he was there and said it was okay. So, you know, you see that, but like that 16-year-old mind was like all on.
And it was an emotion driven.
It was all emotion driven.
I've learned about that, and some of it's come from you, is that you can't have a logical conversation and an emotional one at the same time.
Absolutely.
Like it's impossible.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
And it's interesting. I'm learning more about myself. It's one of the things I've loved about podcasting, to be totally candid, is I'm learning about myself every time I
Absolutely.
podcast.
I learn about myself every time I work with a client.
It's so fun.
Yeah.
And I've learned that one of my biggest strengths is my emotional intelligence and, you know, like empathy and leading with heart and things like that. But I'm actually a very logical person. And like I usually make logical decisions and have logical conversations, and you know, they're usually emotionally backed, but like typically logical
and intuitive, I would say.
And intuitive,
yeah.
and I would say that's another strength of mine too is intuition.
Yeah.
Which I'm so grateful for. But it's been a fun learning process for me to learn that about myself, because I think sometimes people think that I'm like blind emotion and that, you know, it feels good, so I'm going to do it, or like I'm excited about it, so we're rocking and rolling with it.
Right.
I've often talked about with my wife, in our peer groups, we sometimes come across as spontaneous, but we're not. We've been thinking about it for years, a lot of the time, or months, or whatever, and then the opportunity, you know,
shows up,
or we were ready,
and
we did it. And so it's been a cool experience for us because we've been able to make big decisions quickly, because the decision-making process has been happening for a long time.
Yeah.
So anyway, just a little anecdote on that, like with the emotion versus, you know, intellect decision and having those conversations with your daughter. I love it.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears just a little bit.
Sure.
And I want to talk about accountability with all this too, and accountability in leadership specifically. But because I've loved this idea of open-ended questions, bringing our team to the table and like having like these shared decision-making processes and all this stuff like is amazing. One of the things I think a lot of businesses and leaders struggle with is how to hold people, accountability.
Yes.
And
I get asked about this all the time.
I'd love to hear
which is
your.
why I just did a lunch and learn on it a couple weeks ago.
Which I had to miss. So that's the real reason I asked you to be on the podcast.
You just want the cliff notes?
Free lunch and learn. No. Yeah. But I'm genuinely curious about it because it's something, without going into too much detail, one of the things that I've been working on at Ascent Digital has been trackability and accountability. Because we're a very fast growing business and we're starting to actually like scale and which brings all these problems.
Yeah.
It's amazing problems, but it used to be that we could just, casually manage stuff because it was small enough that we had it all. And now as things have grown, I'm realizing there's this need for like insight, tracking, and then accountability and all this stuff too. And I think it also applies on the leadership side of it as well. So anyway, I'm genuinely fascinated about the concept of accountability and would love to, hear your take on it.
Yeah. So there's several things that have to be clear in order to have accountability. And I think a lot of people look at accountability and they think it's either a carrot or a stick, right? And they always ask me, they're like, Ben's not doing what I told him to do. How do I punish him to hold him accountable? And for me, it's more like as a leader, if you set up the right things, you shouldn't have to punish somebody to hold them accountable. You should follow through with what you say you're going to do, and the consequences should be known up front. What's going to happen if the performance isn't there, that kind of thing. But first of all, you need. When you want accountability, you really have to be clear about your expectations. Right? So I could say, write this report and I want it turned into me by Monday because it's due on Tuesday to the person, and they write a report that's 45 pages and what I needed was 3 pages. But what I said was, write this report. I trust you. Go do it, right? But I wasn't clear about my expectations. My expectations are it needs to be under 3 pages and it needs to include these 10 things, right? So being clear about your expectations is super important when you want to hold somebody accountable.
Well, of course. Yeah, I love that.
Of
now
course,
that you say that, it makes so much sense.
But a lot of people don't think of it, right? They're like, go write the report. And then they're like, every time I tell the guy to write the report, he writes it wrong.
Because if there's no expectations, there's nothing to hold people accountable to.
Right. So you as a leader have to be clear, okay? You as a leader have to give feedback about what's going on. So if I had to choose one thing that I would say impacts accountability the most and is the most important thing as a leader to have if you want to have accountability with people, is you have to have difficult conversations. You have to be able to go back and say, when I asked you to write that report, I screwed up because I told you to write it and I didn't give you any parameters. And the feedback that I need you to have is it's supposed to be 3 pages. Can you go back and do it again? Or whatever you need to have.
So you're holding yourself accountable.
You absolutely have to hold yourself accountable to have difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Like you have to be able to give people feedback. In fact, there's one speaker that I saw at a conference I was at learning about leadership. I think it was like a year and a half ago. And he basically said the correlation between when you can have difficult conversations, like when the something occurs that you need to give feedback on, and when you choose to have that difficult conversation, the lag in time there is how healthy your organization is. So if you're the one who says, oh, I'll talk to them about the report later, I'll just fix it on my own, I'll talk to them about it later, and then it's like 2 months down the line and you're like, you know what, it's not really that important because I fixed it and it's not a big deal, right? You never have the conversation, you're not a healthy organization and you don't have a lot of accountability, right? If something happens and you're able to go have that conversation like immediately with the person, right? I noticed when you were talking to that person on the phone that you weren't nice to them when you were talking to them. I just wanted to have a chat about, what was going on with you when that happened, like what our values are, or that we treat people in this way. And so when you do talk to people in the future, I'd really like it if you used a nicer language or something like that. That's feedback and it needs to be given in real time, right? Have you ever had that happen where you're like, I need to give that person feedback and then it just keeps getting pushed away and pushed away and pushed away?
A funny one, but we were very busy the other day. We had like back-to-back meetings. And I was on a meeting And a couple of my team members' body language and posture in the video meeting was
Atrocious.
atrocious.
Yeah, okay.
To put it nicely.
Yeah.
And I screen grabbed it during the meeting. And we had another meeting
Immediately
and I was
after.
like, get over here real quick. And I showed them the screenshot. And I just said,
Yeah.
obviously that can't happen anymore. But that one, to just, to be fair to me, I wasn't like, ooh, I got to deal with it quickly. I had no choice because there was another video meeting.
Yeah,
and I
you
knew
didn't
I
want it
couldn't
to
happen
happen
again
again.
in 5 minutes. But I do love that, knowing that the time between, because one of the things, a philosophy I've been working on is that like we got to solve small problems while they're small. Before they get big. And I think that the timeliness of that contributes to that. Like if right when a problem arises, we solve it or hold each other accountable or whatever, it never has a chance to get big, and it helps, contribute to the health of an organization, which is great.
Right. Because we talked about last time, culture is what we allow to repeat. So if we consistently don't have difficult conversations in real time, then what people learn is I can get away with stuff because I'm never going to be held accountable.
There's no accountability.
Because there's no conversation that's going to happen. I can just slip out the door and he'll forget about it because he's so busy.
Right.
Right? That's not creating a culture of accountability, right? So you have to be clear about your expectations. You have to be clear with your feedback. Another piece that leaders miss a lot of time is you have to be clear about what the skill set is that the people around you need in order to do what you want them to do. Okay? So if you have a videographer that's been around for a year and only been doing this since college, right? And you give them a big, huge project and they screw it up because they don't do what a seasoned videographer would do, that's on you for putting the person with 1 year of experience on a big, huge project, right? What we do a lot of the times, I was just talking to a client about this today, is, I have this person and I put them in this role because I needed that role filled and they were there and they have most of the skills that I need. They don't train them appropriately and they let them go. And then all of a sudden they're like, why aren't they doing their job? I needed part of doing this job is they need to know these skills. Well, 6 months ago, you told me very clearly you knew they didn't have that skill set. You've done nothing to actually train them up on it. They're in the role, and now you're holding them accountable to this high level of performance that you knew they didn't have, right? And so part of it is your expectation setting, being clear about what you expect. But part of it is if this person that you've put in that position doesn't have the skill set that you need it to take it upon yourself to teach them, right? How to do what that job entails.
Yeah.
And that's part of it. But what happens is we get busy, we're leading, we're doing other things. We have our head is going in 8 different directions. And we see like this deficit in this person. But instead of saying like, wow, they have a deficit and I need to find a solution and help them figure this out, we get upset and more upset that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so as a leader, part of your responsibility is to be really clear with what is the skill set that I expect for that position and then providing the training so that they can do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
Right? And this is one of the biggest eye-openers when I did the Lunch and Learn where people like, ooh, yeah, I haven't thought about that, but she's right. Like, I'm trying to hold someone accountable for something that that's not their skill set.
Right.
Right? And so it's like, yeah, we want people to grow into positions, and so we want to give them the skill sets and the opportunities, but then we kind of forget, where we were with that, and so we don't provide that. And so we can't really have accountability for people if we're setting them up for failure.
For sure. Yeah. So I remember when I don't know if you know this or not, but I worked at Enterprise Rent-A-Car for less than a year.
Okay.
Longest year of my life, right out of college.
Okay.
Enterprise Rent-A-Car trainee program. We joke that there's the Enterprise management trainee support group now and all this stuff. But
that's awesome.
But I'll never forget when I resigned, there was this like huge effort to keep me. Like they brought in the area manager and like all this stuff. And I'd been there like 11 months.
Yeah.
And there was an attempt to hold me accountable to what I had signed up for from the job. Mm-hmm. And my response to them is that I never had a problem with that, but I was under the impression that I would have the tools to solve it.
Yes.
And, after 10 months of not having the tools, I realized that I can't solve it. Yeah. And what a good thing for us to remember as leaders is like, and I think there's probably some nuance there and some fine lines because we also want people to grow, and I think that's one of the things that I do. There's a chance I do it too much. I flirt with it of pushing people, like because I genuinely believe that every person is remarkable. Like I sincerely believe it.
I do too.
That people are capable of incredible things.
Absolutely.
And that we all have so much more in us than we realize. And I it's like it's a mission of mine, is to do this whole thing.
Yeah.
That being said, we have to have the right resources and tools and training opportunities, because I think that's probably as leaders sometimes it's like I see so much in this person. And they're not ready, but let's put them here or whatever.
Yeah.
We probably should also send them to the training or do the extra one-on-ones or whatever it might be, so we can hold them accountable. Yeah.
Yeah. Check in with them. Like, is this your skill set? Is this what you want to do?
Is it working? Yeah. And is it even what you want? Good point.
Yeah.
Ask an empowering question.
Yeah. I have a client who she owns a company and she has her people. It's funny, I quoted her, I think on the last time I was on this podcast, but I love her. She has, part of the way her business is structured is that all of her, I think, management staff participates in business development, right? And that's just how she set it up from the beginning. And we were having a conversation and she was saying, none of them are excelling at business development and I don't know what to do. Like, this is part of the model that I use. And I was like, well, do they all have the same skill set? And she's like, no. I'm like, well, what do you expect? So basically what she did is she got to ask them, like, what part of the biz dev cycle do you like the most? Right? She went back to them after we talked and asked them about this, or this is what we talked about. I don't know if she actually did it, but what part of that business development cycle do you like? And it was like one person liked the reaching out to people, but there was another person that was like, oh my God, cold calling is like my worst nightmare, right? So she was wanted to hold them accountable for not doing this business development aspect of their job. But the reality when we started talking about it was like, that wasn't the skill set. Like, say if there was 4 people and there's 4 parts of the business development cycle, it might've been better to put the person who loves cold calling on that part, and then they pass them to somebody else who does the next part.
You get more information.
Right. And she had wanted to hold them accountable to it because they weren't doing great at it or didn't understand it or weren't putting the time into it, when in reality, they're never going to do that, because the person who doesn't want to cold call, I can tell you I don't like cold calling and I would never cold call, whereas you're probably the cold calling king.
No problem.
And totally happy to do it. So if I'm a leader and I've got Ben and Suzy in my corner and we need to do business development, I am putting Ben on the first conversation. Once he's developed a relationship and talked about the business, then I have him meet with Suzy who can close the deal or whatever.
No, I love that. And it's how cool think about how these things tie in together. Like you ask empowering questions, you gather more information, you get more knowledge, you can make better decisions as a leader. When you're doing the accountability process, if you do that same thing, it can also help you have insight and guidance and stuff. One of the things you taught me is, with my business partner and I, we have such different skill sets, such different strengths. And that's the whole point.
Right. Yeah, why are you trying to hold her accountable to do what you do? Right.
Because could you imagine what a disaster this place would be if I had to run operations?
Right.
Like how unfair.
You're very lucky you have Brittany.
Very lucky. Right. And I just love that it's like accountability, and through accountability though, you can also as a leader have actionable insight and more valuable information about all sorts of things.
Right. Like asking what part of the business development cycle is your favorite allowed her to know that this one person hated the cold calling piece, whereas she was just like, they're not prioritizing business development, right? Because when you don't like to do something, you push it to the side and you don't do it.
Or when you're bad at it.
Or when you're bad at it.
Yeah.
So you don't. Well, that's clues for you as a leader. Like, it's not getting done. There's something else going on. So again, tell me what's going on with the business development, stuff. Like, I noticed you're not really doing it. Just open-ended question, right? Walk me through what's been happening there, because it doesn't seem like you're doing what we had talked about you doing. learning about what's the barrier for you to do this.
Right.
Right? That's an open-ended question. I could do it all day long because that's my job is to
Yeah.
ask open-ended questions. People are always like,
Do you remember how hard I had, how hard time I had asking an open-ended question in one of our sessions?
I do.
Like I genuinely tried.
Yeah. And I was like, nope,
I couldn't think
try
of how to
again.
reword it. I'm like, well, I don't know. Answer it open,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Because but it's something I'm
hard.
going to practice because I can see the value in the information you can get,
Yeah.
you know, from it. So
Yeah.
you're
It's
great
really
at it.
hard.
I'm terrible at it.
Well, that's
But
why I'm a
of course,
facilitator
well,
and a coach,
yeah,
right?
I'm getting a little better at it from podcast hosting. Thank
Yes,
goodness.
you
know.
Yes, because that's what you do most of the time is you ask open-ended questions.
Right.
Because if you ask closed questions, it would be this very staticato, podcast where it'd be like, do you like hunting? Yes. Okay. Like you couldn't actually do podcasting if
Right.
you didn't ask open-ended
Which
questions.
and it's been so cool for me. I mean, it's also it's helped me hone in these weaknesses of mine, and open-ended questions are one of them. Because I'm a salesman to my core.
Right.
And so sometimes I navigate conversations too much.
Right.
And like take
Right.
too much control of the conversation or whatever.
And
so
that's a skill in
I'm
and of
learning.
itself.
In the right setting.
That's very beneficial in the right setting.
In the right setting.
So,
Yeah.
The fourth thing for accountability that you need to have is you need to have laid out what the consequences are if things aren't going well. So you have to be
Beforehand.
clear. Well, you have to be clear. You can kind of do it, as you're going, but you do need the people around you need to know, if you're not performing, this is what the consequence of it is, and kind of know if I know the expectations and I know I'm getting feedback and I know that I'm what was the third one I just said? And I know that I have the skill set to do
Yeah.
it, right?
The tools.
Right?
Skill
If
set.
I have that, then if someone's not accomplishing things, there's a deeper issue, and that might require you to take some disciplinary action, which, we do progressive discipline when we're, from the HR perspective, we're doing like a verbal warning and then a written warning and then a final written warning and then you terminate them. But it might not be that laid out. It might be like, I'm going to take you off of, if you can't figure this out, I'm going to take you off that account.
Right.
Right? If you can't get your emotion under control with that particular client, then I'm going to take you off that. So we're going to let you have this next meeting, but if that doesn't go well, this is what's going to happen.
Right.
Instead of waiting for it not to happen and then doing it. It's like with kids, right? You don't say, you didn't pick up your shoes, you don't get to watch TV tonight. You say, like,
If you don't
I'd
pick up
like
your
you to pick
shoes."
your shoes up, and if you don't, then we won't be watching any TV tonight.
Yeah.
Right? So it's that same concept. It's the same concept as parenting, where you're letting them know, you're giving them up front what the reality is if things go well or don't go well. And you're 100% supportive if they go well, and you keep giving them, responsibilities. But if somebody's not performing, you have to be really clear about what your expectation is and what's going to happen if that isn't met.
Yeah.
So
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. I'm going to pivot
How's
one more
that
time.
for accountability?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So we don't run out of time. There's one other topic I want to
Sure.
at least touch on.
Sure.
Imposter syndrome.
Okay.
I'm curious. So, well, I'll just tell you. I'll just be vulnerable.
Sure.
I'm giving a presentation tomorrow that
at the Alliance?
I'm terrified
Okay.
for.
Okay.
Legitimately scared.
Interesting, because
Yeah.
you've done so many of
Yep.
those, and you've done them at the Alliance, right?
Yeah, and I think I'm a pretty skilled public speaker. I think I'm decent at public speaking.
Mm-hmm.
However, I've always public spoke about marketing.
Ah.
This is my first attempt at like a inspirational kind of like, mindset.
Like a keynote?
Kind of, yeah.
Kind of? Okay.
But it's a breakout.
Okay.
I'm not the keynote by any means, thank
Okay.
goodness. And I'm having a hard time figuring out if I'm genuinely the point of the question is the difference between imposter syndrome and just like legitimate insecurity, and some tips and tricks to navigate it. Because at the end of the day, I'm going to go tomorrow, and I think it'll go fine. I'm going to do the dang thing because
Yeah.
I signed up for it, and I believe we can do hard things. And I also believe that it's kind of that like man in the arena thing. Like it's easy to critique the guy that's up there doing it,
Yeah.
but I'm going to be up there and doing it. So I'm like, I'm not like that panicked about it, but it has made me think about like why I'm so nervous for it. Like I did a presentation at Digital Summit in Denver
Yeah.
in June, which was a huge stage for me. And it was industry professionals. And like, I knew there were people in the room that knew more than me, and all that.
Yeah.
But I can talk about marketing in my sleep
Right.
at this point.
Right.
Now I have this like desire in my heart to empower people and motivate people and inspire people and make the world a better place. It's like I was mentioning earlier, like I genuinely believe that the people are incredible.
Yeah.
But I'm freaked out. And I've been having, it's almost like my friend Robel, have you met Robel?
No, but I think was he on your
He's
the podcast?
an amazing person. And he's been on a few times. And he said something to me that I loved, but he basically said that like the rate at which I'm growing right now is so fast that there's no such thing as a comfort zone. Like I'm always out of that comfort zone.
Yeah. Well, you push yourself a lot. So yeah, you're always pushing yourself out of your comfort zone.
Which means I'm always insecure and always uncomfortable and always have kind of imposter syndrome. And so I'm just kind of curious your perspective or your take on, the realities of imposter syndrome and navigating it and things like that. Because this one's feeling heavy for tomorrow.
Okay.
And would just love to hear your perspective on imposter syndrome.
So there's a couple different angles that I'm going to take with this. One is I'm going to ask you a couple questions because I genuinely want to know, like when you are excited about something and then it turns to this like fear, what's that tipping point for you? Like when does it go from excitement to fear for this?
I don't know. I think it just kind of evolves as it gets closer.
Okay, so what are you telling yourself as it gets closer that's changing it from excitement to fear?
That I'm not good enough and I have no right being up there in front of these people. I'm a mediocre podcast host.
Yeah.
I'm a mediocre entrepreneur. I'm a way below average ultra runner.
And that's what you're talking about?
I'm going to be able to stand up and talk about those three things,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So that's actually, I would say that's not imposter syndrome as much as that is your inner critic, which we talked about the last time I was on, right? And that the whole job of the inner critic is to keep you safe and to keep you small.
Right.
Right? So if you succumb to that and you listen to that, then you minimize yourself and you don't take the risks that you've been taking, right? And you're pretty good at it because you keep pushing yourself outside your comfort zone. So you're pretty good at like squashing that. But I think part of it is for you, like part of your growth edge is to acknowledge the presence of that part of you, to thank it for showing up, and then to like, it's almost like we talked about last time, like to externalize it and to be able to say, I really appreciate you showing up. When I work with clients, we externalize it. We actually give it a name. Right? So if you're like, okay, Billy, I see you're showing up again, then it's a part of you, right? This is used in parts therapy where there's a therapy method where they have different parts of you that they actually talk to. But you externalize that inner critic and you get to have a conversation where I know, and we talked about this last time because I say this a lot, but when that guy shows up the strongest is when you're on the edge of greatness.
Yeah.
So right now, like this talk is so different than what you've been doing, but it's actually what's going to propel you way farther than what you've been doing in your marketing stuff, right? Because that like the back of your hand and you can talk about in your sleep. But this is actually the real edge of greatness, right? This is the real like inspire by example, like all of that. Like this is real pedal to the metal stuff. This isn't like I'm an expert and I can talk in my sleep about this. This is where it really like
it's vulnerable.
It's vulnerable.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's kind of
that helps a ton.
Yeah.
Just reframing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what I think of like when I work with clients, like what I would like you to do is think about what you tell yourself when you're in that 100-mile race and you're like feeling like you're going to die and you have to stop. Like, what are the messages you give yourself when you're in those moments?
It's so funny. So yesterday I practiced the presentation with my team and I was telling them how scared I am. And we were going, I was going through like the self-talk, like whatever. And it's hilarious because all I'm doing is the exact thing I'm talking about.
Telling about not to do.
I'm using the things in my presentation to give me the courage to do the dang presentation anyway, which is so ironic and so funny.
Which is also probably why you're thinking that imposter syndrome is showing up, because what you're walking them through is what you walk through.
Right.
Right? And so it's like, if I'm telling them this, but they all probably know how to do this, then why are they going to listen to me?
Right.
Right? So the other angle with imposter syndrome, because I get asked this a ton from leaders specifically, and a lot more often it's women leaders than men. I can just say that from my experience, is about imposter syndrome. And again, I was listening to a podcast with a leader of somebody who works with leaders, and what she said about imposter syndrome is it's starting to be a little overused. Like, people use it a lot. And she's like, every time it shows up, I think it's an excuse. So if I said to you, like, you feeling like you have imposter syndrome is just an excuse, what is it an excuse for?
Right. Fear.
What do you think it is? For fear, right? And so you have to find a way for yourself to like settle, because when I asked you that first question, like where it goes from anxiety to fear, or where it goes from excitement to fear, like that little spot right there is your sweet spot, right? It's like, if you can convince yourself, because you can convince yourself of anything, if you can convince yourself this is excitement, not fear, you're going to be a lot better off.
Yeah.
Right? And acknowledging that piece of you that's trying to keep you small, and saying to that person, like in the mirror, like, I get it, dude. You want to keep me safe, but I am ready.
But we're doing this
to do this.
Yeah.
And I'm
well, and we have no choice.
And we have no choice
because we signed up for the dang thing.
Yeah. Right. But you have to have that conversation. I had that come up when I was going to give a talk at the Craft Brewers Conference, and it was like the largest talk in front of like 350 people. It was the first time I had spoken for a crowd that big, and I remember the night before I was in my hotel room in Denver, and I was like, "All right, like." You're trying to keep me safe, and I totally get it, and you can just piss off because I'm going to go do this and
Appreciate
I'm going to kill
it. See you
it.
later. Yeah.
Right? But you can't skip out on the part where you thank that for showing up, because that's when you just keep pushing forward and you don't recognize that part of you. Then you're kind of on a sinking ship, and you're always kind of trying to keep it afloat. Whereas if you can actually do that, you're getting your footing under you, and you can actually acknowledge that's a part of me that has fear. And the fact that it's showing up means that I'm somewhere cool.
Yeah.
That's like, then you can like let go of it.
Right.
Whereas if you don't and you just keep pushing forward, it's just going to keep rearing its head bigger as you go down. Right.
Yeah.
But it is important. And I am curious, like when you are on your long runs and you're in a race or something, and you are at that point where you're just like, oh my God, I'm going to die if I don't stop. Like, what's your internal messaging in those places?
Yeah, well, that's why. So the whole premise of the presentation tomorrow, it's like using ultra running as a microcosm for life and business.
Yeah.
And that's why I think running is so cool, is because much like anything in our life, we get to these points where the decision really is simple. Like, we either stop or keep going.
Yeah.
And if we stop, we get one outcome, and if we keep going, we get the other one. True. And so it's like, what outcome do we want? Mm-hmm. What are we really made of? And do we know that the pain that we're in this moment is going to change in the next moment? And so there's all these, it's why it's so special to me. And like, running that 100-miler was such a profound experience for me that I really do hope tomorrow goes well. And that's why, actually, you know what? That's why, is because it matters to me. That's why.
Yeah.
Because it actually matters to me that I can effectively articulate how profound it was for me. Yeah. And it's not that like I'm cool because I ran 100 miles. It's like, no, you can too. Yeah. And your version of the 100 miles and whatever. So what I tell myself is just that it's very interesting. It's a very similar conversation to that inner critic. Mm-hmm. That you said we're on the edge of greatness or whatever. When things get hard on my run, what I tell myself is that this is where we get better.
See?
Like, this is the moment. We had to run all the miles before now till get to here, and now we get to get better. Yeah. Because now it started hurting. Now it started getting hard.
So when you're going to go on the stage,
this is where I get to get better.
This is where I get to get better.
Let's go.
And see? Did you see your energy and excitement when you...
all you had to say is that on the edge of greatness, and I'm like, okay, done deal. Like, I'm ready to rock. But,
right.
No, but
your language.
Yeah. Well, and I love it because there's something so just like, and I'm actually really glad that you brought up the fact that imposter syndrome is overused, because I do think if we're not careful, it could be a risk. It could hold us back.
It's a crutch.
Yeah.
Right? If I say I have imposter syndrome, then I don't have to expect things from myself. Right. I don't have to have high expectations of myself.
And it's possibly inauthentic. Because I don't have imposter syndrome. I have fear.
That's right.
I have fear. And it's okay to be scared.
That's right.
Because we can do hard things.
That's right.
And we can, and if I can run 100 miles, I can survive a freaking 45-minute presentation at,
Absolutely.
Economic Summit. But no, I love that. And that's where it's It's my attempt to try to inspire by example. Even the fact that I'm doing it tomorrow is that, like, I'm not going to be the best. It's going to be the first one. It's not going to go perfect and all that stuff and whatever.
And you'll learn.
And I'm going to get a
and
whole
you'll be
lot better.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to do it again.
Yeah.
And then again, and then again, and again.
Yes.
And by the time I record my 60th podcast episode, I might not be terribly nervous, going into it and actually have a little fun sitting and chatting. Yeah. No, it's awesome.
You totally nailed it, Ben, though. That's exactly when people ask about imposter syndrome, it really is just more of a deep-rooted fear. And when you know the messages you can give yourself to get over that fear, you are in such a better place. And you're relying on yourself to, like, push yourself, which is what we should be doing, right? What a lot of people would be doing is talking about how scared they are, or like that they have imposter syndrome, to everybody that they know, to try to get some external, like, validation.
There's been some of that.
That they'll be good, right? Yeah. Well, it's natural. It's what we do. But the benefit of being able to give yourself that validation, it goes back to kind of loving yourself, right? If you can pump yourself up and actually give yourself what you need, that's loving yourself.
Yeah.
Right? Totally.
Love it.
Yeah.
And I love myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know you're going to kill it when you do that. It's just the frame that you put around it is now like, this is where it gets good. This is where I get great. Not imposter syndrome. You'll sleep a lot differently tonight.
Yep. I love that. Yeah. I got my money's worth.
Yeah. Is your free coaching session going well?
It's been great. No, jokes aside, Suzy, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you. Like, I hope you know very sincerely. I love, obviously, having you on the podcast. I love getting to pick your brain. But you've impacted my organization and my life and my business partners and, like, all these dynamics for me. And I just think it's so cool that I get to sit and pick your brain and learn from you. And one of these days, I want to have you on and just talk about life. Like getting to sit and chat off camera with you about, family stuff and the health and these things like that. It's just it's amazing to see. It's so exciting for me to see you thriving in what I believe is your calling, and the fact that I get to benefit from it and have some impact from it is the cherry on top. So anyway, thank you so much. Thank you
I
for
get
being
to benefit
here.
from you thriving in your your calling as well, because having a podcast is awesome. And just being here this time as opposed to last time, I can tell how much more relaxed you are. And it's just a fun experience to be with you when you're doing something that you're so excited about.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
We'll be doing it again for sure.
Absolutely. I'll come back a third time. I'd love to.
Awesome. Thank you, Suzy.
Sure.